The Rites of Spring, Stravinsky, 1913, when it was first performed in Paris, produced a riot. Right? It was the final end of 19th century culture. Right? And, Picasso, Stravinsky, that was a cultural revolution. Right? And you may have noticed, living in Britain, that where our society seems to have arrived at a point of extraordinary fragility, and people are now questioning whether indeed the capitalist system is broken, irretrievably broken. So the Future of Capitalism, my book, is about that question. Right? And it doesn't say capitalism is irretrievably broken, but it is a revolutionary thesis. George Akerlof, Nobel laureate in economics, has described it as the most revolutionary book since Keynes. Right? Keynes wrote in the 1930s. So it's a powerful critique of capitalism as we've got it, but I believe in capitalism. It's the only system we've ever discovered in 10,000 years of human history that's capable of driving up fairly reliably mass living standards. But it doesn't work on autopilot. And for the last 40 years, it's been left on autopilot, and it's derailed. Periodically, capitalism does derail. Right? Capitalism started about 10 miles from where I was born. I was born in Sheffield, right? And the first factory on Earth is 10 miles away. It's now a World Heritage Centre for very good reason. Right? First factory on Earth. Right? Capitalism, at its birth, that was the 1770s. By the 1840s, capitalism had derailed catastrophically. Right? My German grandfather moved from an impoverished village in southern Germany to the most booming city in the whole of Europe, Bradford. And by 1849, Bradford, which was very productive, this cluster of mills, what hit Bradford was cholera. Cholera. Thousands of people were dying because there was no public policy. People were herding into the cities, no public policy, it derailed. Right? Capitalism got back on track. Right? The solutions were actually forged in the northern cities in the 1840s. Business started to accept obligations to both the workforce and the community. So the big boss in Bradford, Sir Titus Salt, he was the biggest businessman. He was the mayor, and he was the local MP. He was messed up big, right? And there he was, his workforce dying on him by the 100, his citizens dying by the 1,000. And it seared his soul. And so he became the Bill Gates of his time. He pioneered sort of business philanthropy, and he gave his entire fortune away. Partly to build the first purpose-built town in the world for the workforce, Saltaire, World Heritage Centre because of the first, right? And the rest of his fortune he gave away to his community, to Bradford. He's still a hero there. Right? So that was business. Just a few miles from Bradford, you go to Rochdale. You know what happened in Rochdale? Same time, 1840s, right? The birth of the world's cooperative movement. Same bloody principle, really. Let's recognize obligations to each other. Families building a network of obligations, you know? And one of the things that the cooperative movement did was address the fact that people were dying very young. Life expectancy collapsed. Life expectancy in the northern cities by the 1840s had fallen to 19. Right? On average, you were dead at 19. Right? On average, everybody in this audience would be dead. Right? And so one of the things you worried about if you were growing up in a northern city was, will I get a funeral? Right? So the cooperative movement became the biggest funeral director in the country. Right? A few miles away, same sort of thing, Halifax. Biggest bank in the country, right? Halifax Building Society. So these were reciprocal obligations. Right? Put capitalism back on the rails. Right? Second derailment, 1930s, mass unemployment. I'm going to skip over that. You all know about that. What you don't know about is the derailment we're living through now, except you can see politically it's a bloody mess, right? So what's actually happened? And you think of the 2008 financial crisis, and that's not it. Right? That's a manifestation, but the real problem begins slowly around 1980. And it's not just in Britain, it's pretty well all the OECD. And it's two new divergences that reverse 200 years of history. For 200 years, up to 1980, the gap between poor regions and richer regions had been narrowing. So for 200 years, you'd got spatial convergence. And then from 1980 onwards, we've had exactly the opposite. It goes into reverse. The big winner, and there's only one big winner around the OECD, and that's the metropolis. Right? Britain's an extreme end of that, where it's just London and its neighbourhood, its environs. Right? No other region in Britain manages to stagger above national average per capita income. Right? Everywhere is below. So London. So that's the spatial divergence. Completely new, it gets wider and wider for 40 years. And then the other new divergence, again reversing 200 years of convergence, is between the less educated and the more educated. For 200 years, that gap narrows, and then from 1980 onwards, it's widened again. Right? Economically, what's driving these two new rifts, pretty straightforward, is globalization, which produces fewer, bigger winning cities, and occasionally knocks out provincial cities that were winners. Right? I'm from Sheffield. You all know what happened to Sheffield because you've all seen the full Monty. You've just forgotten that's Sheffield, right? That's my relatives, right? And it wasn't funny. Huh? So that's the spatial divergence. It's just globalization, more and more markets going global, so room for fewer, bigger winners. And then the other rift, the new premium upon tertiary education is a simple thing. It's due to the rise in the complexity of production. To increase productivity, first you do the simple things. They're done in the 19th century. Then you do the fairly simple things. That's the first half of the 20th century. By the 1980s, you're driven to, oh God, something really complicated. And complicated things that need complicated skills, and complicated skills need a decent tertiary education. So the people with a decent tertiary education are getting an education on which they can build these specialist skills. And meanwhile, the rising complexity is actually destroying the manual skills that the less well-educated invested in. Now, these two processes, the spatial divergence and the new class divergence, are then correlated. Because, of course, if you're a smart, well-educated kid from Sheffield, you don't stay in Sheffield, right? You move to the metropolis or its fancy satellites, right, called Oxford. So you end up with a metropolis disproportionately full of well-educated, skilled people, and they are on a continuous up escalator for 40 years, right? And the less educated in the provinces are on a continuous down escalator for 40 years. Right? Very few people here are old enough to know who Harold Macmillan was, but he came out with a winning election campaign slogan, which was, "You've never had it so good." but he said it of provincial manual workers. Right? No politician in their right mind, and even many of those not in their right mind, would actually go to provincial England today and say to manual workers, you've never had it so good. Right? So those are the two divergences. What happened? Nothing. I mean, in terms of public policy, they were just neglected. Right? Why? Well, here's the view of course, the political power of leadership always rests with the metropolitan skilled. They're the educated who run the political parties and so on. And I'm going to take what I think of as the finest journalist who encapsulates the mentality of the metropolitan skilled. And that's the political commentator for the Financial Times, Janan Ganesh. Right? I think he's a brilliant and a perceptive political commentator, but he epitomizes the metropolitan skilled. That's what he is. Financial Times has just redeployed him from London to Bradford? No, to Washington, right? Home from home, right? So what does Janan Ganesh say about the view of himself and the metropolitan skilled about provincial England, right? Probably includes Folkestone, right? He says, it feels like being shackled to a corpse. Right? Shackled to a corpse. You hear that? You hear the empathy, the hope, the concern, right? I mean, this is an extraordinary sentiment, and of course it produces no reaction at all, right? People shrug. Well, there's no Financial Times letter reacting to that, you know. If he said it about one of the fashionable victim groups, he'd be out of his job in 2 days. But you can say the rest of Britain feels shackled to a corpse, and they just, yeah, that's right, just what it feels like. Can we have London-only visas, please? Right? Can we peel off from this corpse? Right? So what's happened? What explains that sentiment of Janan Ganesh and the fact that perfectly acceptable description, accurate description, right? What explains it is an ethical collapse over the last 50 years or so. I mean, that sentiment would have been inconceivable 40, 50 years ago, right? So what brings that ethical collapse or ethical decline? Three things. One is the rise of individuals replace families and firms. So instead of groups like the group of the family, the group of the firm, we move everything to the individual, the achievement of the individual. Right? The second thing is we move from obligations to your group, we move to rights. Right? So all the discourse is now upon rights, not obligations. Right? Of course, there can't be any rights unless somebody's prepared to pick up some obligations. So obligations are the fundamental concept, but they're never mentioned. Right? Where do the obligations go? They go up to the state. Right? So the obligations shift from families and firms because we're individuals trapped in families and firms. We want to be liberated to our free individual rights, and all these obligations go up to the state, which then showers down upon us like rainfall, rights, individual rights. And of course, you know, just like it rains more in Sheffield than it does here, rights shower down differentially as well, but not actually on Sheffield. And then the final element is the invention of economic man, for which my profession has to take the blame. Right? So economic man is manufactured in about the 1950s becomes dominant intellectually by the 1960s. An economic man is a description of human beings which economists sort of assume is inevitable from evolutionary process, right? So what is economic man? He is greedy, and he's selfish, and nothing else. Oh, he's lazy. I'm sorry, I should have added that. He's greedy, he's selfish, and he's lazy. End of story. Right? Well, we're all a bit greedy, we're all a bit selfish, we're all a bit lazy, but the idea that that's all that we are is a travesty of human being. But if you accept economic man, it has implications, which we'll come to. The economic man can only then be understood as the array of incentives he faces, and the incentives are structured in markets. So here's this greedy, selfish, lazy animal whose behavior is understandable as maximizing behavior within the context of markets. So families and firms disappear as morally load-bearing entities. The only morally load-bearing actor becomes the state. It's going to try and maximize utility, but all the individual people in the state are only interested in maximizing their own utility. So you need some saints at the top of society. Plato solved that. You need Platonic Guardians. Right? Plato was a bit dumb, though. He thought they were philosophers, and economists put him right there. Right? So the Platonic Guardians, since about the 1960s, have been economists, with the odd lawyer thrown in. And the state faces an unenviable job. It's got all these obligations that it has to meet, and it's trying to meet them by getting behavior amongst a bunch of people who are incapable of any moral load-bearing. They're just greedy, lazy, selfish, right? And so the only way we can do that is by carrots, offering carrots to economic man, tied to very closely monitored performance, right? So I'm going to watch you like a hawk, and if you do the things I want you to do, you'll get a carrot, right? If you do the wrong things, you'll get a stick, right? So that's the system which is built. It's recommended as the structure for how to run a firm, and the state copies it and does it in the public sector as well. Right? Does it work? The evidence for that's what's happening is the things called the Jobs and Skills Survey. The Jobs and Skills Survey is an annual survey which has been done across Britain for the last 25 years. And one of the questions it's asked every year is, do you have enough discretion in your job to do it properly, essentially? Right? And 25 years ago, most people said, yeah. Right? There's been a 40% drop in yes. Now most people say no, right? Because we're all shriveled to this carrot-hunting, monitored individual who's not trusted. It doesn't work. Yeah? One reason it doesn't work is that as behavior gets more complex, which has indeed happened, as complexity increases, the amount of behavior that can be codified falls relative to the amount of tacit knowledge. And so there's a shift from knowledge that's codifiable and hence monitorable to knowledge that isn't codifiable and hence can't be monitored. It's tacit, right? But a good decision depends upon using all that tacit knowledge. Right? Just think what's happened to British teachers, right? They're monitored to death, incentivized with codified aspects of behavior, and the children are monitored to death as well. The contrast is with the best system we know in Europe, pretty well in the world, which is Finland. And they do exactly the opposite. Decentralize, empower teachers so that they can use all that tacit knowledge and don't bother testing the children. Trust the teacher. So the only time the Finns test is right at the end of education with the PISA scores. So we're using the full Monty of incentives, monitored performance, and test, and they're doing none of that. They just say, empower teachers and trust teachers and expect teachers to fulfill their obligations as a good teacher to to educate those children as best they think. And finally, when we get to the PISA scores, it's a bit embarrassing because all our wonderful new theories of how to motivate economic man produce performance down here, and the Finns have performance up there. Right? So it doesn't work. Right? It doesn't work in firms either. There's a wonderful Harvard Business School study on the battle between General Motors and Toyota. And this is immensely well studied because at the beginning of the story, General Motors is the biggest, most profitable company there's ever been on Earth. By the end of the story, it's 2009, and General Motors is bankrupt. And there's no question about what killed General Motors, it was the rise of Toyota. Right? And the difference between General Motors and Toyota is that General Motors does all this monitoring, carrots, and that sort of stuff on its workforce. And so there's zero trust by management of workforce, and consequently there's zero loyalty by workforce to managers. Whereas Toyota does exactly the opposite. Right? It's like Finland. They pioneer these things called quality circles. Right? You're a quality circle, you're responsible for that little bit of the line. Right? There's a conveyor belt to make a car. And along the conveyor belt in Toyota, there's cords hanging down called andon cords. Any worker at any time who spots a fault on that line can pull the cord. What happens? The entire production line stops. Is that a little bit costly? $10,000 a minute. Right? This is wildly costly. You can one pull, and you can destroy all the productivity of a year's work. Right? One pull. But the Toyota workers are loyal, and they know you pull it when you see a fault, but not just when you want to have a smoke. Right? Anyway, eventually, 10,000 consultancy reports later, the chief executive of General Motors gets it. Oh, God, we got to trust the workforce. Right? So they got andon cords, we got andon cords. Right? So all along the line at General Motors, andon cords hanging down. Right? The line managers know all too well what's going to happen when Joe gets an andon cord. Right? Joe has been hating General Motors for years, and now is Joe's chance, right? So the line managers tie the cords up so they can't be pulled, right? We trust you, but not really, right? That's where so it's culture, but culture can't be changed on a dime. And so General Motors goes bankrupt, finally understanding but unable to change its culture. Right? So let me turn from what's gone wrong to what we can do to put it right. Huh? And it'll be quick. We need to reverse these two rifts, the spatial rift between the provinces and the metropolis, and the class rift between the educated and the less educated. And we don't do it by shoveling consumption from the south to the north. We don't put the north of England on Benefit Street. That is the fundamental misunderstanding of economic man, as if the only thing we care about is consumption. Right? People are not economic man. They're human beings who care about dignity, respect, esteem, and for that, you need to be productive. And so what we've got to equalize is not consumption, it's productivity. People have got to get a sense that they can contribute to society. Get back to being morally load-bearing by being capable and willing of contributing. Is that all romantic, the idea that we care about obligations as well as about our own consumption? Well, I'll give you a little exercise you can do tonight. All right? This is a social psychology test, and I warn you, it's painful. It's more painful the older you are, right? By my age, actually, you shouldn't attempt it, right? You ready? All right? But don't do it now. Tonight in a quiet moment, right? Not over the age of 60, right? Okay, you write down the 3 biggest regrets in your life. That's it, right? But you've got to be honest about it. The 3 biggest decisions that you regret taking. Right? What the psychologists did was then get all those responses and put them in buckets, right? There's a bucket here called economic man. It's quite clear if we're economic man, what are the 3 big regrets, right? I should have bought that house. If only I hadn't messed up that interview with Goldman Sachs. I wish I'd bought Apple shares, right? You know? You look in that box, it's empty. Right? We all make mistakes like that. We all regret them. They're not the big 3. Right? So you go and have a look in the big 3 bucket. I don't want to look, actually. Right? But it's all of the form, I let down my mother. I let down my friend. I let down my colleague. It's breaches of obligations. They're the stuff that's really painful. We are naturally hardwired through evolution to be morally load-bearing, to be capable of bearing obligations. And when we breach them, we feel a lot of pain, which is why usually we don't breach them. So, 3 minutes? Yeah. How can we reverse these things? I guess he had to say yeah, didn't he? Okay, so how do we close these productivity gaps? 2 things we've got to do. One is a baby is born with a brain but no mind. A brain is an individual endowment, a mind is a social construct. Right? We've got to turn a baby with a brain into a 24-year-old with a mind that is equipped with the capacity to be productive and motivated to contribute. That passage from the baby to the 24-year-old passes through a whole swathe of public policy, a whole swathe of different actors, firms, families, schools, they're all in there. Right? If you read the book, you'll find we know what to do it all along that chain. It's just that nobody's putting it all together. Right? And Britain certainly isn't. So that's turning a baby into a productive 24-year-old. Then we've got to provide a job for that productive 24-year-old that meets their capacities. Right? And that's where economics particularly comes in, because we've had a very inhumane form of globalization in which to get a productive job, you've got to go to the metropolis. Right? And so London is full of young people. If you look at the happiness ratings, London is the least happy region of the whole of Britain. It's got the highest income and the lowest happiness. It's incredibly inefficient at turning income into happiness. Right? It's lousy, right? And so what we need is to bring productive jobs to people closer to where they belong. That doesn't mean we bring productivity everywhere, but every region needs to have a city which is hopeful, where there's credible hope. We know how to do that. The one city which has managed to do that in Britain is Edinburgh. I was there in January, and they've got a cocktail of producing it. Let me give you the recipe, and then I'll stop. So the recipe is pretty straightforward. You need a local government with quite a lot of autonomy. You've got to decentralize. Huh? By political fluke, Edinburgh's got that because of Scottish nationalism. You need a local finance industry. Finance can't just be in London. Right? You need decentralized finance. Germany's done that, Britain hasn't. Right? Finance always starts local because it's so information intensive. Right? And in Britain, it got centralized in London, and in Germany, it stayed local. Right? So decentralized finance. You need a business community that is organized locally. Britain's business community is quite bad at organizing locally. Too much is organized nationally. Right? And then finally, you need a good university, and then all those four entities work together. 10 years ago, Edinburgh, which has all those four things, the four entities got together. The university sat with the local government, sat with the business community and local financial community, and said, where are the jobs going to be in Edinburgh in 10, 20 years' time? They decided they'd get a new sector, IT. They did an inventory of how many IT firms have we got in Edinburgh at the moment. 10 years ago, they got 2. But they all worked. They decided that's going to be the sector we go for. Now, they've got 480. They're the biggest IT cluster in the whole of Europe. Right? It is possible to bring bright new industries, bright new sectors to places that are a long way from the metropolis. Right? They've done it. Right? Edinburgh's the only place we've done it, because it's the only place we've got that combination. On that, thank you.